Beneath the frozen soil of Alaska, archaeologists have discovered something that shouldn't exist. Tools made from mammoth ivory crafted with precision and purpose, dating back 14,000 years. But here's the problem. According to everything we thought we knew, humans weren't supposed to be there. Not yet. Not for another 1,000 years. Not in this place. Not with this level of sophistication. This isn't just another archaeological find, sitting quietly in a museum case. This is a moment when our entire understanding of how and when humans first arrived in North America fundamentally changed. This is the kind of discovery that forces entire institutions to reconsider their positions, that causes textbooks to be rewritten, that reshapes academic careers and challenges the consensus view of thousands of scholars. For over a century, we've built an entire narrative around the Clovis people. We told ourselves that they were the first Americans, that they arrived roughly 13,000 years ago across a frozen land bridge connecting Asia to what we now call Alaska. We created textbooks based on this belief. We constructed elaborate timelines, built comprehensive theories, and educated generations of students with this story presented as established fact. It was repeated so consistently that it became almost unquestionable, a bedrock assumption about American history. And then, in 2016 and 2017, scientists began excavating a site in Alaska's middle Tanana Valley, carefully removing layers of earth that had been frozen for thousands of years. As they worked through the seasons, as they cataloged each artifact and took measurements and photographs and samples, as the scope of what they were finding became increasingly apparent, everything we thought we knew started to crumble. The evidence was right there in front of them, layer after layer, telling a story that nobody expected. The Holtzman site, named after its location along Shaw Creek, near the confluence with the Tanana River, became an unexpected time capsule of human behavior from the deep past. When researchers from Adelphi University and the University of Alaska Fairbanks examined what they had found, they realized they were holding evidence of human civilization that predated the Clovis by over 1,000 years. This wasn't vague evidence or ambiguous artifacts open to interpretation. This was clear, documented, carefully excavated proof. The oldest layers at this site contained artifacts and evidence dating from 13,000 to 14,100 years ago, with careful radiocarbon dating establishing the chronology. In the deepest, oldest section of the excavation, scientists discovered something absolutely remarkable. There was an almost completely intact female woolly mammoth tusk, preserved by the frozen ground. This wasn't just bone lying around by chance. This was intentionally placed. Someone had brought this tusk to this location and positioned it carefully, perhaps storing it for future use or valuing it for its symbolic or practical significance. Alongside it were carefully made stone tools, flake tools that showed deliberate craftsmanship, evidence of precise hammer strikes, suggesting purposeful, planned tool creation by experienced toolmakers. There were animal bones scattered throughout, indicating methodical food preparation and consumption. Red ochre was present in the layer, a pigment that early humans used for various purposes we still don't entirely understand, whether for artistic expression, ceremonial practice, or practical applications like hide processing. And crucially, there were unmistakable traces of fire, of burning wood and bone, and of knapping. That's the deliberate, careful fracturing of stone to create sharp edges and specialized tools designed for specific tasks. But that was just the beginning. In a slightly younger layer, dated to approximately 13,700 years ago, making it clearly distinguishable, and later than the lower deposits, the team uncovered something even more extraordinary. They found an extensive workshop, a manufacturing center that reveals the economic and technological organization of these ancient people. This wasn't a temporary camp established for a single season or a hasty shelter built for emergency survival. This was a dedicated workspace where humans were engaged in serious, organized manufacturing over an extended period. The layer was exceptionally rich with quartz, the essential raw material for toolmaking, suggesting deliberate collection and stockpiling. Scattered throughout the excavation in dense concentrations were fragments of mammoth ivory, tons of them, the byproducts of intensive tool production undertaken over months or years. Someone was working here consistently, creating tools with skill and purpose, discarding the pieces they didn't need, building up layer upon layer of waste from their manufacturing process. The concentration and distribution of artifacts tells us that this wasn't casual work. This was a dedicated operation. And most significantly, they discovered the earliest known ivory rod tools ever found in the Americas. Tools unlike anything archaeologists had expected to find in North America at this time. These weren't crude experimental implements made by people learning their craft for the first time. These were sophisticated, purposefully designed tools made from one of the hardest materials available, mammoth ivory, carefully worked into specific shapes by people who clearly understood their craft deeply, who had mastered techniques that required knowledge passed down through generations. Think about what this means. Someone was here 14,000 years ago, during a time when most of North America was still gripped by glacial conditions. They were intelligent enough to hunt or scavenge mammoths, one of the most dangerous animals on the planet, weighing up to 6 tons and standing as tall as a house. They understood how to process the ivory, to break it, to work it, to understand its properties, and how to manipulate it into useful forms. They were organized enough to maintain a semi-permanent workshop, to return to the same location repeatedly across years or decades, to develop and systematically refine their techniques through experimentation and practice. They were creating tools that would help them survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, places where a single mistake could mean death from exposure or starvation. They were doing all of this while massive ice sheets, miles high, still covered much of North America to the south and west. The climate was unpredictable and dangerous, with sudden changes in temperature and season. Megafauna, like woolly mammoths and giant bison, roamed the landscape, creating both opportunity and threat. These were people of remarkable capability and determination. The preservation at the Holzman site is absolutely remarkable and represents one of the greatest assets for understanding ancient human life. The lower layers remain frozen for much of the year, creating permafrost conditions that have persisted for thousands of years. This means that organic materials that would normally decompose in temperate climates have been preserved in extraordinary, almost pristine condition. The research team recovered not just stone tools and bone fragments, but actual ancient plant DNA recovered from the sediments and incorporated into preserved plant remains. They even found a single strand of bison hair that dated back 13,600 years, more than 100 years older than the initial human occupation layer. The presence of such delicate organic material tells us that the preservation conditions here are exceptional. In the modern archaeological world, this kind of preservation is extraordinarily rare and valuable. Most sites around the world, whether in tropical regions, temperate zones, or even other cold climates, don't offer this level of detail about the past or the preservation of such fragile materials. The Tanana Valley, with its permanently frozen ground and remarkably stable environmental conditions over millennia, had essentially created a perfect preservative environment that allowed scientists to glimpse details about ancient life and ecology that would normally be lost forever to decay in the passage of time. When the research team, led by Brian Weigel from Adelphi University, began analyzing what they had found, they started to piece together a narrative. The tools they were examining didn't exist in isolation. They weren't unique to this single site. The methods used to create the ivory tools, the techniques, the sophistication, these all resembled something that archaeologists had seen before. They resembled the tools created by the Clovis people, the culture that had long been considered the earliest in North America. But the Clovis tools were only around 13,000 years old. These Alaskan tools were older. They were the ancestors, the precursors, the missing link that scientists had been searching for. For decades, even for centuries, archaeologists had struggled with a fundamental question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How did the Clovis culture suddenly appear in North America with such sophisticated technology? Where did they come from? How did their particular toolkit, their distinctive fluted projectile points, their hunting strategies develop? Where was their evolutionary path in the archaeological record? The conventional answer had been that they evolved somewhere else, perhaps in Asia or in some unknown region, and then migrated to the Americas fully formed. But there had always been a gap in the evidence, a missing link, a mystery that refused to be solved. Now, with the Holzman site, that gap was being filled. The missing pieces were being found. The answer was becoming clearer. The Clovis didn't appear out of nowhere, like a fully formed culture springing from the earth. They were descended from people who had been in Alaska for at least 1,000 years, probably much longer, before the classic Clovis culture emerged in recognizable form in the archaeological record. The research team published their findings in a journal called Quaternary International in December of 2025, but the announcement came in early 2026, and it sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The paper, titled Stone and Mammoth Ivory Tool Production, Circulation, and Human Dispersals in the Middle Tanana Valley, Alaska, presented a carefully documented argument. The authors noted that while the tools provide strong evidence for a technological lineage connecting Alaskan groups with later Clovis populations, the implications go far beyond simple tool design. These findings support what's called the inland route model for human migration into North America. Here's what scientists now believe happened. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, the region wasn't entirely impassable. There were refuges, places where the climate was slightly milder, where vegetation could survive, where animals could find food. One of these refugees was the Tanana Valley. People lived here. They hunted mammoths. They processed the ivory. They made tools. They survived in conditions that would challenge modern humans even with all our technology. When the climate began to change, when the ice sheets started to retreat, these valley dwellers began to move. They migrated south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the retreating glaciers. This corridor was like a highway through the ice, a passageway that allowed human populations to spread southward and eastward across North America. The Clovis culture, when it appeared in the archaeological record 13,000 years ago, showed unmistakable signs of being a developed, mature culture with deep historical roots. They had established hunting strategies that had been refined and tested across time, refined tool-making techniques that showed centuries of development, and a widespread presence across the Great Plains and beyond, spanning vast territories. They showed up in the archaeological record not as primitive newcomers just discovering how to make tools, but as people who had already developed sophisticated methods refined to a high degree. The question that had always puzzled archaeologists was, where did all this sophistication come from? Where did they learn these techniques? Who taught them? Now, the answer was becoming clear. They inherited it. They didn't invent it themselves. Their ancestors, the people of the Tanana Valley and surrounding regions, had developed these technologies over many generations. They had refined their craft across centuries, maybe even millennia of continuous habitation and experimentation. When they moved south, responding to climate change and following game herds, they brought this accumulated knowledge with them. The significance of mammoth ivory in this narrative cannot be overstated. Mammoth ivory became a signature material of the Clovis toolkit. Across Clovis archaeological sites, from the Great Plains to other regions, ivory appears repeatedly. But before the Holzman site discovery, scientists didn't know where this tradition originated. They didn't understand why ivory was so central to Clovis culture. The answer, it turns out, lies in Alaska. The Tanana Valley people were pioneering ivory work. They were the first to recognize that mammoth ivory, despite being one of the hardest materials available, could be worked into sophisticated tools. They learned to split it, to shape it, to create implements that served specific purposes. This knowledge, this skill set, this understanding of how to work with ivory was then passed down through generations and eventually became a hallmark of Clovis technology. What's particularly fascinating is that the mammoths themselves played a crucial role in early human survival in the Americas. Recent research, including studies published in scientific journals like Science Advances, has shown that mammoths were a primary food source for early American hunter-gatherers. The Clovis people relied on mammoths for approximately 40% of their diet. This wasn't occasional hunting. This wasn't a supplement to other sources. This was a core survival strategy. These people were mammoth hunters. They had developed sophisticated hunting techniques specifically to bring down these massive animals, and they had developed toolkits to process the carcasses, to harvest the useful materials, to create implements from the bones and ivory. At the Holzman site, there's evidence that this relationship with mammoths extended beyond just hunting for food. Yes, the bones suggest that people were eating these animals, but the ivory work suggests something deeper. The mammoths were providing raw materials for tool manufacture, for innovation, for technological development. The relationship between early humans and these megafauna was complex and sophisticated. Humans weren't simply passive hunters taking what they could. They were actively processing and utilizing every part of the animal. They were innovating, creating new tools and techniques, developing strategies that would persist through thousands of years of human history. The broader implications of the Holzman site discovery extend even further than the migration timeline. The site provides physical evidence of human adaptation to extreme environments. The Tanana Valley, even in the relatively milder periods during the last ice age, was not a forgiving place. The climate was unpredictable. The growing season was short. Large animals were abundant, but they were dangerous. These people not only survived in these conditions, they thrived. They developed sophisticated technologies. They maintained permanent or semi-permanent settlements. They engaged in artistic practices like the use of red ochre. They created a culture that persisted long enough to eventually give rise to the Clovis and ultimately to all the Native American peoples who would populate the continent over the next 12,000 years. The research team emphasized that the Holzman site doesn't exist in isolation. The Tanana Valley contains multiple deeply stratified archaeological sites with cultural layers extending back to the Pleistocene. The Meade site, the Broken Mammoth site, and the Carpenter site all contribute to a growing body of evidence showing that this region was home to some of the earliest human populations in North America. Each site adds details. Each layer of excavation adds context. Each artifact recovered adds another piece to the puzzle. When viewed together, these sites present a compelling narrative of continuous human occupation and cultural development spanning thousands of years. But the Holzman site specifically stands out because of what it preserves and what it reveals about human technology and behavior. The workshop areas, the tool production debris, the carefully preserved mammoth tusks, the evidence of fire use and food preparation, all of this comes together to create a detailed snapshot of life 14,000 years ago. It's not just knowing that humans were there, it's understanding what they were doing, how they were organized, what they prioritized, what skills they had mastered. One of the most intriguing aspects of the discovery is what it suggests about cultural continuity. The authors of the research paper argue that the similarities between the Alaskan artifacts and later Clovis materials indicate shared manufacturing traditions. These aren't just similar tools that arose independently. These are tools that show a lineage, a connection, a transfer of knowledge across time and geography. The technique used to create ivory rod tools in Alaska appears in later Clovis sites. The preference for specific types of stone like quartz appears across both cultures. The overall toolkit, the technological strategy, shows continuity. This suggests that we're looking at ancestors and descendants, at a cultural tradition that was maintained and refined across generations. The research also sheds light on resource circulation across eastern Beringia. The researchers note that mammoth ivory and high-quality lithic materials, that's stone suitable for toolmaking, appear to have circulated across vast distances. Materials moved from the Tanana Valley southward. Knowledge moved with them. Trading networks, or at least contact networks, connected populations across what is now Alaska and down into what would become the core territories of Clovis culture. This suggests a level of social organization and communication that we often don't associate with peoples living during the Ice Age. But clearly, these were not isolated groups. They were connected, communicating, sharing resources and knowledge. The discovery of the Holtzman site also contributed to overturning what had been the dominant narrative in American archaeology for over a century. The idea that the Clovis people were the first Americans had held sway since the 1930s. During the 20th century, this belief was so strong that evidence contradicting it was often dismissed or ignored. When archaeologists found sites that seemed to predate Clovis, the findings were frequently questioned, challenged, or simply not accepted by the broader community. This created a kind of confirmation bias in the field. If you believed that Clovis was first, you tended to be skeptical of any evidence suggesting otherwise. But over the past several decades, that position has become increasingly untenable. Multiple lines of evidence, each more compelling than the last, have forced the archaeological community to reconsider. The footprints at White Sands in New Mexico, while their dating methodology remains somewhat controversial, suggest human presence in North America more than 20,000 years ago. The coastal kelp highway hypothesis proposes that early humans traveled along ocean, routes when the land was blocked by ice, reaching the Americas perhaps even earlier than the inland route would suggest. Sites in South America and Central America have produced evidence of human occupation dating to 15,000, 16,000, even 18,000 years ago in some cases. Piece by piece, the old Clovis first paradigm has collapsed. The Holtzman site fits perfectly into this revised timeline. It's not the oldest site. There's evidence of earlier human presence in the Americas, but it's one of the most clearly documented, one of the most thoroughly excavated, and one that provides the most detailed information about how early Americans lived, what technologies they possessed, and how they adapted to their environment. It's a bridge between the earliest human presence in Beringia and the later development of Clovis culture. It helps explain the transition, fills in crucial gaps, and provides a mechanism by which early Asians or Beringians could have developed into the ancestral populations that would give rise to all Native American peoples. The chronology is becoming clearer. The earliest evidence suggests human presence in the Americas dating back at least 15,000 to 20,000 years, possibly even earlier. By 14,000 years ago, clearly established populations were living in Alaska, creating sophisticated tools, hunting megafauna, and developing cultural practices. By 13,500 years ago, the pre-Clovis populations of the Kenosha sites in Wisconsin were already established east of the Mississippi River, butchering mammoths and creating their own toolkit. By 13,000 years ago, Clovis culture appears fully formed in the archaeological record, spanning the Great Plains and other regions. This represents roughly 7,000 years of human presence in North America before the Clovis appeared, a period during which populations adapted to their environment, developed technologies, spread across the landscape, and eventually developed into the diverse cultures that would characterize Native America. The preservation of organic materials at the Holtzman site, including plant DNA in the 13,600-year-old bison hair, opens new research possibilities. Genetic analysis of these materials could potentially provide insights into diet, climate, and environmental conditions. At the time these people lived, DNA from the ancient ivory and bone tools might reveal information about the mammoths themselves, their age, their health status, their relationship to other mammoth populations. The red ochre found at the site could be analyzed for its source location, potentially revealing trade networks or resource procurement strategies. Every artifact, every fragment, every preserved organic material potentially holds information that could deepen our understanding of life during the late Pleistocene. The role of mammoths in this story deserves particular attention. These were remarkable animals, standing up to 11 feet tall and weighing up to 6 tons. They were adapted to cold climates, covered in thick fur, carrying substantial fat reserves. When humans hunted them, the rewards were enormous. A single mammoth provided enough meat to feed a group of people for weeks. The ivory provided material for tools, weapons, and possibly art. The bones could be used for construction, for fuel, for toolmaking. The hide provided material for clothing and shelter. In essence, a mammoth was a complete resource package. It's no wonder that mammoth hunting became central to early human culture in North America. And it's no wonder that the ability to work mammoth ivory became a valued skill, a mark of cultural sophistication, a technique that was preserved and refined and eventually passed down to become a hallmark of Clovis culture. The extinction of mammoths is another piece of the puzzle. These animals didn't disappear overnight. The woolly mammoth persisted in North America until roughly 4,000 years ago, though their populations were in decline for much longer. The relationship between human hunting and climate change and driving mammoth extinction remains debated. Some scientists argue that climate change was the primary driver, as warming temperatures reduced the grasslands that mammoths depended on for food. Others argue that human hunting pressure was the decisive factor. Most likely, it was a combination. Climate change reduced available habitat and food sources, making mammoth populations vulnerable. Meanwhile, human hunting pressure, made more effective by developing technologies and techniques, pushed populations beyond the point of recovery. The mammoths that inspired the tool-making innovation at the Holtzman site would eventually succumb to a combination of environmental change and human predation. The contemporary relevance of these discoveries shouldn't be overlooked. As we confront climate change and environmental challenges in the modern world, the story of early human adaptation to changing climates becomes relevant. The people of the Tanana Valley lived through periods of dramatic climate change. They adapted, innovated, and developed strategies that allowed not just survival, but cultural flourishing. They didn't retreat or disappear. They developed new technologies, found new resources, and persisted. There are lessons there about human resilience, adaptation, and innovation that speak to contemporary challenges. The discovery also has profound implications for how we understand Native American history and identity. For too long, the story of the Americas began with European arrival. Everything before that was treated as prehistory, a blank slate awaiting discovery. But clearly, the Americas have a deep human history, a history of innovation, cultural development, environmental adaptation, and social organization that extends back over 15,000 years and possibly much longer. The peoples who developed the Clovis culture, whose ancestors lived at sites like the Holtzman, were participants in a grand historical narrative that stretches across continents and millennia. They were not primitive peoples. They were innovative, skilled, organized, and culturally sophisticated. They created technologies that persisted for thousands of years. They adapted to their environment with intelligence and ingenuity. The research team's work also demonstrates the power of careful, systematic archaeological excavation and analysis. The Holtzman site was excavated in 2016 and 2017, but the analysis and publication of results took years. The team examined every layer carefully, documented every find, applied multiple dating techniques to establish chronology, and considered the broader context of other sites in the region. This meticulous approach, while time-consuming, produces results that can withstand scrutiny and contribute meaningfully to our understanding of the past. In an era where quick results and sensational claims sometimes dominate headlines, the Holtzman site research reminds us of the value of patient, careful scholarship. Looking forward, the Holtzman site and related discoveries in the Tanana Valley will likely continue to generate research and new insights. Future investigations might employ technologies that don't yet exist, revealing information that current methods cannot detect. Advanced genetic analysis might provide unprecedented detail about the people who lived there. Isotopic analysis of bones and teeth might reveal diet and migration patterns. Continued excavation might uncover additional sites in the region, further filling in the archaeological record. The Tanana Valley, with its remarkable preservation conditions, remains a frontier for understanding early American history. The broader picture that emerges from the Holtzman site and related evidence is one of long-term human presence in North America, of continuous cultural development, of adaptation and innovation in response to environmental challenges. It's a picture that contradicts the older narrative of Clovis as first arrivals bringing a fully developed culture from elsewhere. Instead, it suggests that the foundation for what we call Clovis culture was laid by earlier populations who developed technologies, refined techniques, and created the cultural traditions that their descendants would carry forward. The mammoth ivory tools of Alaska evolved into the sophisticated Clovis toolkit. The hunting strategies developed in the valleys of Alaska were refined and adapted to the Great Plains. The social organization that allowed communities to maintain permanent workshops and coordinate hunts set the stage for the more complex societies that would develop later. And so, beneath the frozen soil of Alaska, in layers of earth that preserve materials 14,000 years old, scientists have found the answer to a question that had puzzled archaeologists for over a century. Humans were there in North America far earlier than previously documented. They were sophisticated, skilled, and innovative. They created technologies that would persist for millennia. They developed cultural practices that connected them to their environment and to each other. They were not the Clovis. They were the ancestors of the Clovis, the first Alaskans, the pioneers who crossed the frozen land bridge and discovered a new world. Their tools, carefully crafted from mammoth ivory and stone, are silent witnesses to human ingenuity, determination, and the eternal human drive to innovate, adapt, and survive in even the most challenging environments. The Holzman site doesn't just rewrite the timeline of American history, it reveals the deep roots of human presence on this continent and reminds us that the story of America is far older, far richer, and far more complex than anyone had previously imagined.